Good evening, everyone, and welcome back. I think what might be episode number 10 or 11. I really should be doing a better job of keeping track of all these things we've done. I think this is we're going into maybe month 3 of our lovely Gallic War readings, and we are nearing the end. That's right, we are very close to the end. We're not quite there, but we're close. Thank you everyone for joining me today. We are doing this live on Twitch, twitch.tv/author Valentine. We do this on Wednesday nights. Well, nights for me. I live in Japan, so this is done at 6 p.m. JST for me. You can join us live if you prefer. If you're watching on YouTube, thank you for sticking around for these. You can like and subscribe to the channel. Greatly benefits it. I've been trying to put out some more Rome-related content. I have just released a video about the top 5 villains of the Gallic War, and going through each one from Dumnorix to Vercingetorix and others, what they did, the threat they posed to Caesar and the Romans. So you can check that out. I'll be posting more hopefully every week, in addition to the ones I'm already doing for the stream that you are presently here for, or you're listening to. So, where are we? Well, we're in the year 52 BC, and we've been here for a while. We've divided this year up into 3 parts because it's quite long. If you're following along in the book, if you're reading the book, this is book... I'll tell you right here. It's been so long since we started it. This is book 7, year 52 BC. The sole consul for the year is Pompey. And the reason why we divvied this up is first because of the length, and also because I felt like each event needed its own look, its own reaction. So we've done the first 2. We've done Avaricum, the Siege of Avaricum, which was the first great battle of 52 BC, where Caesar and his men were starving. There was heavy rains, the Gauls were entrenched, and they were cutting off the Romans from supplies. But in a surprise attack during a rather heavy storm, Caesar led the Romans to victory. And the starving Romans, as Caesar writes in his commentaries, had no mind for booty, and they proceeded to massacre the city, take the food, and he said it was an absolute slaughter. This forced Vercingetorix to retreat, and he went to the city of Gergovia, and that's where Caesar engaged him in the second battle. That's what we read about last week. Now in Gergovia, it started out well enough, but during the siege, Caesar's greatest ally, the Aedui tribe, had a fracture in it, and 2 men were elected to the magistracy, and this caused quite a stir. So Caesar went, and there was a call. An emissary came from the Aedui and said, "Hey, we need help to figure this out." So Caesar, in the middle of a siege, had to go interfere and help them out, and the man he appointed, Convictolatavis, for reasons of him being the only one technically eligible. The other one's name was Cottus, and he was not eligible by Aeduan law, Caesar says, because his brother had held the magistracy, and Aeduan law forbid family members from continuing on with their position to prevent dynasties from rising up. And so Convictolatavis takes control of the Aedui. He becomes the supreme magistrate. And immediately he gets bribed by the Arverni, which is Vercingetorix's tribe, and he betrays Caesar. So, go figure. So Convictolatavis, along with one of his cronies named Lidovicus, basically organized a grand betrayal. Lidovicus gets put in charge of 10,000 men who are marching to Gergovia to aid Caesar. And while they're marching there, while they're approaching, Lidovicus, he starts approaching these men, and he's like, why are we going to Gergovia? We should be going back to our homes because Caesar has massacred everyone. He's killed our cavalry, he's killed our government, everyone's dead. And he basically embarks on a fake news propaganda cycle. He brings over some quote-unquote witnesses who said they saw the Romans kill all the cavalry. And then there were Romans who were also traveling with the Aedui, because there were Romans living among them. And those Romans were brought out, tortured, and brutally murdered. They were supposed to be under the protection of the Aedui, and they were betrayed and massacred. It's a dark night in Gaul. Now, Caesar finds out about this before that army gets there, and so he sends some of the cavalry, who were, of course, still alive, back to the Gallic army. And then once they start mingling around, and the Gallic army realizes, wait, you guys are alive, what's going on here? Litaviccus runs away. He runs to Vercingetorix's camp, and the situation with the Aedui seems temporarily to be solved. However, Convicta Latavius and the rest of the conspirators manage to convince the rest of the state that going to war with Caesar is the only way. And instant karma occurs, because they meet with Vercingetorix and they demand, because they're the most powerful and important tribe in Gaul, they demand that command of the Gallic forces be remitted to them instead of Vercingetorix. And everyone around there says no. They vote no. They say, no way, Jose. You might have been first when the Romans are around, but now you're just part of the horde, bros. And so the Aedui have to eat their choices. And now they are the plebs of the Gallic horde. And can't really feel bad for them after what they did. Now, because of this distraction, Caesar was forced to go back and forth with the Aedui. He couldn't focus on the siege, and the people he put in charge did not do a good job. I'll put it that way. Caesar was going to withdraw from the siege, but then he saw an opportunity to see some high ground. I'm just summarizing here so we all know where we're at. And he engages successfully at first. However, some of his men pushed up too far, and then when the sound to halt the advance was given, the right flank, so the flank opposite from him, kept moving forward, as Caesar says. And this causes a big problem, because even though they get some initial success, which spurs them on even further, well, the Gauls rally, and several hundred Romans are pushed out and killed during the siege. And Caesar's advantage, even though he managed to take an advantage on the high ground, is immediately lost. And he decides, you know what, it's not worth it, let's pull out. So what happens? Well, Caesar leaves, and Vercingetorix declares, because this is technically a Gallic W, he says, now's the time to end the war. So he gets all his cavalry. He has an immense number of cavalry, something like 15,000. And he's planning to attack the legions as they're marching, do a three-pronged attack, essentially, and just cut them to pieces. But the Romans rally, and they manage to defend. Not only that, but the Roman cavalry allied and the German cavalry, who Caesar has summoned from across the Rhine, not only defend themselves, but they rout the attacking Gauls. And this is huge, because now, despite having a W, and everyone feeling high and mighty on the Gallic side, the leadership, the cavalry, has completely blundered their attack. And now the advantage they thought they had has been lost. And that brings us to today's reading. We are in, finally, the last and most important part, arguably, of the year 52. The Siege of Alesia. This is the most famous siege, maybe of any war. In fact, I would say, except for maybe the Siege of Troy, if you're going way back. And the Trojan horse thing and all that. Because there's been plenty of movies made about that one. But I would say this is probably the most famous or infamous siege of antiquity. Everybody knows about Alesia. They're like, isn't that the one with the two walls? It's like, yeah, that's the one with the two walls. And we'll get to that, don't you worry. So with that said, with the preamble given, so you all know where we're at, let's go ahead and see what Caesar has to say. Here we go. Caesar says, the actual stronghold of Alesia was in an extremely lofty position on top of a hill, apparently impregnable, except by means of a siege. On two sides, the foot of this hill was washed by rivers, and for about 3 miles there stretched a plain in front of the town. Close by, in every other direction, more hills of equal height girded the town. Beneath the wall, where the hill faced east, the Gallic forces filled the entire space. They had constructed a ditch and a 6-foot wall. The length of the siege works which the Romans had started reached 10 miles. Camps had been pitched at suitable locations, and 23 forts built along the line. These forts were garrisoned in the daytime, to guard against unexpected sorties. At night, sentries and reinforced patrols kept watch there. After work on the siege had begun, a cavalry battle took place in the 3-mile stretch of plain which we mentioned above, as lying between the hills. Both sides fought fiercely. When our men got into difficulties, Caesar sent the Germans to their assistance and stationed the legions in front of the camps to prevent any sudden invasion by the enemy infantry. Now that they had the protection of the legions, our cavalry's courage rose. The enemy were routed. There were so many of them that they got in one another's way as they fled. They were crushed together in a heap at the gates, which they had left too narrow. The Germans pursued them eagerly right up to their ditch and wall. Massive slaughter ensued, as some of the Gauls abandoned their horses and tried to cross the ditch and climb over the wall. Caesar ordered the legions he had stationed just outside the camp ramparts to advance a short way. The Gauls inside the fortifications were equally terrified, and sounded the call to arms in the belief that an assault was imminent. Some were in such a panic that they forced their way into the town. Vercingetorix ordered the closing of the gates to stop the camp from being completely deserted. After killing many and capturing a number of horses, the Germans withdrew. Vercingetorix now decided to send all his cavalry away by night before the Romans completed their siege works. As they left, he told each of them to go to his own people and muster for battle all the men of age to bear arms. He described the services he had done them and called upon them to take thought for his safety and not abandon him to the enemy's torments after he had done so much to secure the liberty of all. Finally, he reminded them that any hint of negligence in them would bring about the deaths of 80,000 picked men, as well as his own. Once the plan was adopted, Vercingetorix had barely enough corn for 30 days, though by practicing economy it could be made to last a little longer. Once his orders were issued, during the second watch he sent the cavalry away noiselessly through a gap in our siege works. He demanded that all corn be sent to him, and decreed the death penalty for those who disobeyed. There was an abundance of livestock which had been wrested from the Mandubi, and this he shared out among individuals. He arranged for corn to be shared out gradually and sparingly, and withdrew all the forces which he had posted in front of the town back inside. Now these arrangements were in place. He began to await reinforcements from Gaul and prepare to conduct his campaign. All these arrangements were relayed to Caesar by deserters and prisoners. He then decided to set up the following types of fortification. He had a 20-foot wide ditch dug, with vertical sides, so that the bottom of the ditch was as wide as its edges at the top. He fixed the position of all the other fortifications 400 paces back from the ditch, with the intention of preventing an unexpected or nighttime onslaught on them by the enemy army, and of stopping the enemy aiming missiles at our men while they were busy building on the siege works, for the area they had enclosed was necessarily of a considerable size, and it would be difficult to encircle the entire site with a cordon of soldiers. At this distance away, then, he extended 2 more ditches of the same depth, but 15 across. He filled the inner one, which was on lower lying ground in the plain, with water diverted from the river. Behind them he constructed an earthwork with a rampart on top, 12 feet high. To this he attached a parapet and battlements, with large pointed stakes projecting out at the joints where the parapet attached to the earthwork. This would slow down an enemy ascent. He placed towers all around the siege works at intervals of 80 feet. Our forces were obliged to find timber and corn and to construct these extensive fortifications simultaneously. Because they regularly advanced considerable distances from the camp, their numbers were depleted as a result. Sometimes the Gauls would try to test our defensive works by making a sortie in strength from several of the town's gates. For this reason, Caesar deemed it necessary to add to the works, to facilitate manning of the fortifications by a smaller number of soldiers. Tree trunks and thick branches were cut down, stripped of their bark, and sharpened at the end. Ditches 5 feet deep were dug, and the stakes inserted into them and fastened firmly at the bottom so they could not be torn up. The branches were left projecting. There were 5 rows of stakes to a ditch, all joined and interlinked. Anyone who made his way into them would be impaled on the extremely sharp spikes. The men called them gravestones. In front of them, set out in the diagonal rows of a quincunx pattern, pits were dug 3 feet deep, sloping slightly inwards from top to bottom. Smooth stakes, as thick as a man's thigh and sharpened and tempered at the end, were sunk into the pits. They projected no more than 3 inches from the ground. For strength and stability, earth was trodden in around them to a depth of 1 foot, and the rest of the pit was then covered with twigs and brushwood to camouflage the trap. 8 rows of such pits were dug at 3-foot intervals. From the resemblance to a flower, the men called these lilies. In front of them, logs were dug into the earth. Each of them was a foot long and covered with iron hooks. These were scattered everywhere, a little way apart. The men called them spurs. Once these measures were completed, Caesar constructed similar fortifications following the flattest line that the terrain allowed. These encompassed a 14-mile circuit, facing in the opposite direction against the enemy outside. This ensured that the garrison on the defenses could not be overcome even by a great host should the occasion arise. To avoid being forced to take risk of leaving camp, he ordered everyone to see that corn and forage for 30 days was gathered. While this was going on at Alesia, the Gauls called a meeting of their leaders. They decided not to follow Vercingetorix's proposal that all men able to bear arms should be called up, but rather to levy a certain number from each state. This would prevent their creating so large and ill-assorted an army that it would be impossible to exercise control or pick out their own people, or provide enough corn. From the Aedui and their dependents, the Segusiavi, the Ambulareti, Alurci, Branavicus, and Bulanovi, they demanded 35,000, and an equal number from the Arverni, together with the Elateti, Cadurci, Gabali, and Valavi. All of these people are usually under Arvernian rule. From the Sequani, Senonis, Biturigus, Santoni, Ruteni, and Carnutus, they demanded 12,000 each, and 10,000 each from the Bellovaci and Lemavicus, 8,000 each from the Pictonus, Tironi, Parisi, and Helveti, 5,000 each from the Suessonius, Ambiani, Mediomatrici, Petricori, Nervi, Marini, and Nidiobrigus. The same from the Alurci, Senomani, 4,000 from the Atribates, 3,000 from the Velocasi, Lexovi, and Alurci Ebrovicus, 2,000 from the Rorici and Boii, 30,000 in total from the maritime states which call themselves Aramoric, including the Curia Solitas, Redonis, Ambibari, Coletus, Assismi, Veneti, and Venelli. Of these states, the Bellovaci did not complete their quota, because they declared that they were going to fight the Romans independently, and in their own name, and so would not bow to anyone else's command. At the request of Commius, however, they did send 2,000 men along with the rest, for the sake of their friendship with him. Caesar had enjoyed the loyalty and good offices of this Commius in Britain in previous years. In return for these services, Caesar had declared that his state was to be exempt from taxation. He had restored its rights and laws, and made the Morini pay it tribute. In spite of this, the whole of Gaul was united in the desire of restoring liberty and their former reputation for warfare, to such an extent that neither services rendered nor the remembrance of friendship moved them, and they all concentrated all their efforts of will and resources on the war. Once 8,000 cavalry and about 240,000 infantry were mustered, a review and reckoning of numbers was held in Aeduan territory. Then officers were assigned. The chief commands went to Commius the Atrebatian, the Aeduans Viridiromarus and Eporidorix, and the Arvernian Vercassivelanus, who was a cousin of Vercingetorix. Subordinates from the Gallic states were assigned to them to advise on the conduct of the campaign. They all set out for Alesia eager and full of confidence. Not a single one of them believed it would be possible to withstand even the sight of such a mighty host, especially as the battle would be fought on two fronts. For at the moment, when this vast army of horse and foot came into view from the outside, there was to be a sortie from the towers. As for those who were trapped inside Alesia, the day when they had expected their reinforcements to arrive was past. Their corn was all gone, and they knew nothing of what was happening among the Aedui. So they called a meeting to debate the outcome of their situation. Various opinions were declared, some advising surrender, others urging a sortie while they still had the strength for it. The speech of Cridonatus, vile and remarkable for its cruelty, should not be passed over here. Cridonatus was an Arvernian of noble birth and considered to be a man of great influence. "Not one word shall I speak," he said, "concerning the opinion of those men who call shameful slavery by the name of surrender, nor do I think they should be treated as citizens of Gaul, or called to our assemblies. My concern is with those who are proposing a sortie, for this advice of theirs seems, through your support for it, to preserve some remembrance of former courage. Yet it is not courage, but a weak spirit, which is unable to endure such trifling hardship. It is easier to find men ready and willing to face death than men prepared to endure suffering with forbearance. Even so, I might have approved their advice. Such is the force of their prestige, if I expected no loss from it beyond that of our lives. Yet we must look to the whole of Gaul in forming our plans, for it is the whole of Gaul that we have summoned to our assistance. If 80,000 men are killed in this one place, what do you think the state of mind of our relations and kinsmen will be when they are forced to give battle practically on top of the corpses? Do not rob them of your help, when they have ignored the danger threatening them to save you. And do not bring the whole of Gaul to ruin, or commit it to endless slavery because of your reckless lack of judgment or weakness of purpose. Or do you doubt their loyalty and determination because they have not arrived on the exact day? What then? Do you think that the Romans are hard at work on those outer defenses every day for their own amusement? If you cannot find encouragement from their messengers because every approach is blockaded, let the Romans be your witnesses that they are drawing near. For it is fear of that event which keeps them busy day and night on the fortifications. So now, what do I advise? Do what our ancestors did in the war, a much less important one, with the Cimbri and the Teutoni, when they were forced into the towns under the strain of a deprivation like our own. They sustained their existence on the bodies of those who were too old to be of use in the campaign, and as a result they did avoid surrendering to their enemies. And if we had no precedent for such a practice, I would I would still judge it a fine policy to establish for the sake of liberty, and to hand down to our descendants. After all, what resemblance was there between that war and the present one? Certainly, once Gaul was devastated and destruction widespread, the Cimbri did finally depart from our land and go in search of other territories. They left us our own laws and rights, our lands and liberty. In contrast, what do the Romans seek? What do they desire, if not to follow envy's prompting, to become established in the lands and states of people whose distinguished reputation and military strength they acknowledge, and to inflict perpetual slavery upon them? Never have they waged a war on terms other than these. But if you are ignorant of what happens among far-off peoples, look at the part of Gaul which borders our land. Reduced to the status of a province, its rights and laws changed, subjected to Roman dominion. It is oppressed by perpetual slavery. After everyone's opinions were expressed, they decided that all those whose age or infirmity made them useless in the war should leave the town, and resolved to try every course of action before resorting to Critinatus's proposal. But if circumstances were pressing and the reinforcements were delayed, then that was the time to put his advice into practice, rather than submitting terms of peace and surrender. The Mandubi, who had received them into the town, were forced to take their wives and children and depart from it. When they came to the Roman fortifications, in tears they begged and pleaded to be accepted as slaves and given food. Caesar, however, set guards on the rampart and refused to admit them. Oof. So let's talk about what just happened. I have my green screen set up, and I have a new light, but I feel like it's making me look almost like a horror movie here, but I'm going to show you guys anyway. Here I am. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the situation that the Gauls in Alesia are finding themselves in. Well, to put it simply, they're starving to death. They are hungry, and they are running out of options because they don't know that anyone else is coming to help them. Even though there's 250,000 or some odd Gauls from different states who are being summoned, they don't know this yet. No messengers have gotten through. So they're trying to decide what to do. Some say we should just try to get terms of peace. Let's just end this. Some say that they should just sort you out. Let's do an attack. Try to finish this. And Critinatus, this guy whose speech that Caesar actually recorded, says we need to hold out. He says, let the proof be in the actions of the Romans right now. Because what are they doing right now? They're not building fortifications facing us. They're building fortifications facing the outside. They're afraid of something coming in, and he's right. He's a clever guy, and he says, back in the day, during the Cimbrian War, which, if you don't know, that was a war fought by Caesar's uncle, Gaius Marius, well, in part by his uncle. The Cimbrian Teutonus they were Germanic tribes, and they migrated down south, and they went through Gaul, and they sacked the you-know-what out of Gaul. And so that's the war that Critinatus is referencing right here. And he says, when that was going on, our ancestors basically just resorted to cannibalism. They said, well, we're starving, but, we'll just eat the old people. And so they did, because, well, Gauls. But he says we shouldn't be feeling like we should do any less in this situation. This is an even more dire situation, he says. He says, we have to maintain the liberty of Gaul. So this is how they see it. It's not really accurate, but this is kind of the propaganda that they've invented for themselves. They say liberty of Gaul, but what does that really mean? Liberty for who to do what? For them to enslave the other tribes, for new, kings to rise up, for other tribes to be shut down, subjugated, sold over to the Germans, whatever. The reality is their practices aren't different from anyone else's. They don't have any kind of liberty that you might be thinking of. This isn't Braveheart. We're not living free in this country. It's not happening. So they resolve to not sort it out. They're just going to try to wait it out. And the poor Mandubi, because remember, this city, Alesia, is not a city of the Arverni tribe. This is not one of Vercingetorix's hometowns. It's not where it's his own people. This is a city of another tribe called the Mandubi. And the Mandubi, this is like one of their major cities, right? They've got their women and children here. They've got old folk. And Vercingetorix is like, hey, we're starving. We can't feed you, so we're kicking you out of your own city. So he gathers all the Mandubi, and he kicks them out of their own city. And he forces them to march to Caesar, and they beg Caesar to let him in. And Caesar's like, I don't got the supplies to feed you guys. Go back. And so, what do you think happens to these people? They die. They're stuck in a field between Caesar's walls and Alesia. It's their city. And, well, no one's letting them in or out, so they perish. Too bad. Too bad, I guess. So that's how the battle almost ended, I'd say, but for the great speech of Cridonatus, which takes us into the next section. For those who are asking, yes, there is a YouTube channel here. You can use the command YouTube and it'll take you to the channel. I upload all of these from the very first one to this one. I try to get them up within a day or two after the stream. So you can check those out there. All right. So let's continue reading. Caesar says, meanwhile, Commius and the other leaders entrusted with the supreme command reached Alesia with all their forces. They occupied a hill outside, less than a mile from our fortifications, and took up position there. The next day, they brought their cavalry out of camp and filled the whole of the plain which we described earlier as being 3 miles across. They withdrew their infantry force a short distance and halted it on high ground. From the town of Alesia, there was a clear view onto the plain. Once the reinforcements were sighted, the besieged inhabitants hurried together and began to congratulate one another. Everyone was stirred into a state of rejoicing, so they led their army out and took up position in front of the camp. They covered the nearest trench with wicker hurdles and filled it in with earth, then made ready for a sortie and any eventuality. Caesar arranged his entire army along the 2 lines of defense so that, if the occasion arose, each man would know his own station and stick to it. Then he ordered the cavalry to be led out of camp and engaged in battle. There was a clear view from the camps located all around the top of the ridge, so every soldier was watching intently for the outcome. The Gauls had interspersed a few archers and light-armed skirmishers among their horsemen to offer assistance if their own side gave ground, and to resist the charge of our cavalry. A number of our soldiers were unexpectedly wounded by these men and began to leave the fighting. The Gauls were now convinced that their men were the better fighters, and could see that ours were hard-pressed by their weight of numbers. From all directions, shouting and howling went up from the Gauls within the defenses and from those who had come to their aid, strengthening the resolve of their men. The action took place in full view of all, and it was impossible for any deed, be it courageous or cowardly, to be concealed. Thus, the desire for praise and the fear of failure roused both sides to acts of bravery. The fighting continued without a definite outcome from midday almost until sunset. Then, in one part of the battle, the Germans massed their squadrons, charged the enemy, and routed them. Once the Gallic cavalry was put to flight, the archers were surrounded and killed. Likewise, elsewhere our men pursued the Gallic fugitives right up to their camp, giving them no chance to reform. Those who had advanced from Alesia almost gave up hope of victory and returned to the town in dejection. A day went by, during which time the Gauls manufactured a large quantity of wicker hurdles, ladders, and grappling hooks. At dead of night, they quietly left their camp and approached the lines of defense in the plain. Suddenly, a cry went up, which signaled their arrival to those who were besieged in the town. Then the Gauls began to throw down the hurdles and use slings, arrows, and stones to dislodge our men from the rampart, and they got ready everything they needed for an attack. At the moment when the shout was heard, Vercingetorix had the trumpet sound the signal to his men, and led them out of the town. Our men took up the positions which they had previously been assigned on the defenses, and by the use of slings firing large stones, stakes earlier set out along the defenses, and missiles, they frightened off the Gauls. Darkness decreased visibility, with the result that both sides incurred many casualties. The artillery machines kept up a hail of missiles. The defense of these sectors had been allotted to the legates Mark Antony and Gaius Trebonius. They took men from the towers further away, and sent them to assist as reinforcements where they realized our men were under pressure. While the Gauls were some distance from the defenses, they had the advantage of numbers of missiles. But when they came up closer, they were impaled on the spurs, or fell into the pits and were transfixed, or they were killed by pikes thrown from the rampart and towers. Casualties were heavy on both sides, but there was no breach in the defenses. As dawn approached, therefore, the Gauls were afraid of encirclement on their exposed flank from the Roman camp higher up, and retreated to their comrades. While this was happening, those inside the town fetched out the equipment Vercingetorix had made ready for a sortie, and fixed in the first set of trenches. But they took too long over their arrangements, and before they reached the defenses, learned that their comrades had withdrawn. So they returned to the town without accomplishing their purpose. The Gauls had now suffered serious setbacks on 2 occasions, and began to discuss what to do. They summoned men who knew the area well, and from them found out about the site and defenses of the Roman camp on the higher ground. There was a hill to the north, which our men had been unable to include in the siege works because of its large circumference. They had been obliged to set up the camp on ground which, because of a gradual slope, was slightly disadvantageous. In charge of it were the legates Gaius Antistius Reginus and Gaius Caninus Rebilus, with 2 legions. Once their scouts had reconnoitered the area, the Gallic leaders chose 60,000 of their men, from the states which had the greatest reputation for courage. They decided among themselves in secret what must be done, and in what manner, then fixed the time for the attack at midday. In charge of this force was an Arvernian called Vercassivellaunus. He was one of the 4 Gallic leaders, and a kinsman of Vercingetorix. During the first watch, he left camp. After nearly completing his march by daybreak, he concealed himself beyond the mountain and ordered his soldiers to rest and recover from their efforts of the previous night. When noon drew near, he set out against the camp we described above. At the same time, the cavalry began to ride up to the defenses in the plain, and the rest of the force appeared in front of the camp. Vercingetorix saw his men from the citadel of Alesia and marched out of the town, taking the wicker hurdles, poles, and shelters, siege hooks, and the rest of the equipment he had made ready for the sortie. At one and the same moment there was fighting on every side, and every expedient was put to the test. Wherever a hint of weakness appeared, there they flocked to the attack. The Roman force was strung out along its extensive fortifications, and found rallying to the defense difficult in many places. The shouting which arose behind them was effective in frightening our men as they fought, for they realized that the risk to themselves depended on the courage shown by others. After all, it is usually the case that what is unseen is more effective in disturbing men's minds. Caesar took over a suitable spot and found out what was happening in every quarter. He sent help to those who were in difficulties. Both sides realized that this was the very moment for putting their utmost effort into the fight. The Gauls must despair of saving themselves unless they broke through the Roman defenses, and the Romans, if they held firm, were looking forward to the end of all their labors. The struggle was hardest on the upper defenses, where, as we explained, Vercassivellaunus had been sent. The unfavorable downward slope of the site played a crucial part. Some of the enemy threw missiles, others formed a tortoise, and moved up close. Exhausted troops were continually being replaced by fresh. They all threw earth onto the defenses, which gave the Gauls means of ascent, as well as covering over the defenses which the Romans had hidden in the ground. Our men were now running out of weapons, and running out of strength. When he realized what was happening, Caesar sent Labienus with 6 cohorts to help the men in trouble. He told him that if it was impossible to hold his ground, he should withdraw his forces and then launch a counterattack. But this was only to be done in an emergency. Caesar then approached the rest of the men in person and urged them not to give up the struggle. He explained how the fruits of all their previous battles depended on that day, that hour. Inside the Roman lines, the enemy abandoned hope of success on the level ground because of the size of the defenses, so they tried to climb one of the steep ascents to take it, and had all the equipment they had prepared conveyed there. A hail of missiles from the defenders on the towers scattered them, but they filled in the ditches with earth and hurdles, and started to tear down the rampart and parapet with grappling hooks. Caesar sent first the young Brutus with some cohorts, then his legate Gaius Fabius with more. Finally, when the fighting grew more fierce, he came in person, leading fresh troops for reinforcements. The battle was renewed, and the enemy forced back. Then Caesar made for the place where he had sent Labienus. He withdrew 4 cohorts from the nearest fort and ordered one section of the cavalry to follow him, the rest to move around the outer defenses and attack the enemy from the rear. Once Labienus had found that neither earthworks nor ditches could stand up to the enemy attack, he gathered 11 cohorts, which happened to be available after their withdrawal from nearby guard posts. He then sent word to Caesar of what he thought needed to be done. Caesar hurried to join in the fighting. The conspicuous color of the cloak he habitually wore in battle proclaimed his arrival. Because the downward slopes were in clear view from the heights above, the enemy spotted the cavalry squadron and cohorts he had ordered to follow him, and joined battle. A shout went up from both sides, and was answered by another from the rampart and defense works. Our men threw their spears, then fought with swords. Suddenly, the cavalry was glimpsed in the rear. More cohorts were advancing. The enemy turned tail, and the cavalry charged them as they fled. Massive slaughter followed. Sedulius, the commander and leader of the Lemovicus, was killed. The Arvernian Vercassivellaunus was taken alive as he fled. 74 military standards were brought back to Caesar. Only a few of the vast enemy host made their way safely back to camp. Those in the town viewed the slaughter and the fight of their comrades. Abandoning hope, they withdrew their forces from the defenses. As soon as the news broke, the Gauls fled from their camp. If our men had not been exhausted after numerous relief efforts and all the struggles of the day, they would have been able to wipe out the entire enemy army. The cavalry was sent out at around midnight and caught up with the enemy rearguard. Many of the enemy were taken and killed, and the rest fled to their home states. The following day, Vercingetorix called a council and argued that he had undertaken this war not in his own interests, but for the liberty of all. Since they were forced to yield to fortune, he went on, he was putting himself in their hands, ready for either outcome, whether they wanted to make reparation to the Romans by putting him to death or to hand him over alive. They sent envoys to Caesar to discuss these options, and he'd ordered them to give up their weapons and bring out the ringleaders. Then he took his seat within the fortifications in front of his camp, and the ringleaders were brought to him there. Vercingetorix was handed over, and weapons were thrown down. Caesar had the Aedui and Arverni kept back, in case he could use them to win back their state's allegiance, and the rest of the prisoners he shared out as booty, one apiece, to his entire army. Once this business was settled, he set out for the territory of the Aedui and won back their nation. The Arvernian envoys who had been sent there pledged to carry out whatever he told them to do. He demanded a large number of hostages. Then he sent the legions to winter quarters. He returned about 20,000 prisoners to the Aedui and Arverni. He ordered Titus Labienus to take 2 legions and the cavalry and set out for the land of the Sequani, assigning to him Marcus Sempronius Rutilius. He posted his legates Gaius Fabius and Lucius Minucius Bacillus with 2 legions among the Remi, to prevent any defeat being inflicted by the neighboring Bellovaci. He sent Gaius Anticius Reginus to the Ambibereti, Titus Sextius to the Biturigus, and Gaius Caninius Rebilus to the Ruteni, each with a single legion. He stationed Quintus Tullius Cicero and Publius Sulpicius at Cabellonum and Matisco, Aeduan settlements near the Saone, to arrange a supply of corn. He himself decided to winter at Bibracte. When dispatches arrived at Rome giving news of these events, a thanksgiving of 20 days was decreed. That brings us to the close. The year 52 BC, and the Siege of Alesia. Caesar, of course, he tries his best to keep the Aedui prisoners and Arverni prisoners alive, those being powerful states. The Aedui, of course, being longtime friends of the Romans. He makes sure that the prisoners are not mistreated, and he returns them to their people. And thus, in doing so, they basically rejoin the fold. The Aedui especially. Interesting, he doesn't say what happened to Convicta Latavus or Lidovicus, the Aedui leaders who revolted and essentially went to join Vercingetorix. So we don't have any idea what happened to these 2 men. It's very possible that they were both killed at Alesia during the battle, but we just don't know. They might have fled and gone somewhere else, tried to hide among other tribes. We have no clue. So what really happened? Well, the Gauls had all the advantages here. They had a far superior numerical advantage. They had hundreds of thousands of men, hundreds of thousands. The Romans had Tens of thousands. So, unfortunately, well, fortunately for the Romans, but unfortunately for the Gauls, they weren't able to coordinate their efforts as well as they would have liked. They tried 3 different attacks. The second one especially was a bit unfortunate for them because the Gauls outside of Alesia were attacking, and they were hoping that the ones inside of Alesia could, come in and take the Romans from behind while this huge amount of pressure was being put on. But Vercingetorix and his men were very slow on the uptake, so by the time they had finally gone up to the defenses, the walls of Alesia, there was the fighting essentially had already ended. The Gauls on the outside had already withdrawn. They said, we can't do anything about this. And then that last engagement was probably the best hope for the Gauls, because they did manage to breach the walls, right? There was a hill outside of Alesia that the Romans had not been able to incorporate into the defense work. Caesar mentions because of its circumference. It was just too big. They couldn't include it in. And so the Gauls were able to take that hill, and that gave them high ground over the Romans, and they were able to breach the defenses on that side, and they tried to send everyone over there. But in the end, Labienus went to there to help, and then Caesar followed. Caesar, of course, was forced to join in the fighting on this occasion as well. It's not the first time. And the Romans were victorious. And you would think that would be the very end, right? This is probably the most united that Gaul was in its defense efforts, or rather its efforts to resist the Romans. And kind of this tragedy of their own making. But sadly, for them, it's not how the cards played out. So where does that leave us? Well, I'll tell you. It leaves us in the year 51 BC. It is the very last year of the Gallic War. It's a bit of a long chapter, so we might be able to get through the whole thing next time. But I'll tell you guys I'll give you guys a little preview. It's called the 8th book, and it's not written by Caesar. This is by Aulus Hirtius. Hirtius, here's a fun fact. Hirtius was a consul when Octavian came to power, and he was killed in battle. And once he was killed, that's when Octavian went to the Senate and said, hey, it's time to make me a consul. And they were forced to give in. But that comes later. That glorious event is not now. The Roman calendar's year marks this as AUC 703. The consuls are Servius Sulpicius Rufus and Marcus Claudius Marcellus. And the title of this chapter is The Final Pacification of Gaul, Preparations for Civil War. This is, like I said, the only book that wasn't written by Caesar. And there is a foreword by Aulus Hirtius that he wrote in regards to this fact, about him actually writing this and it being included in Caesar's memoirs. And so he tries to copy Caesar's style and write as if he were Caesar. And I think he does a very good job. It reads very well and very similarly to the previous chapters. But that is for next week, which will be our last stream of the Gallic War. And that'll be it. That means if you guys have been listening this whole time, you will have read with me in the entire book. Well, plus my silly commentaries just for you guys. And after that, well, there's another book that Caesar wrote. I have it right here. I'm holding it in my hands. And it's called The Civil War. And so perhaps if you guys want to keep listening to these and getting them uploaded to YouTube, we can move on to that and continue our Wednesday night extravaganzas just for you guys. But we'll see. That's a bit of a different animal. And no one likes civil wars. They're terrible things. All right. We're going to stop it there. This was a shorter reading just because it was the last part of chapter 7, but we have made it through the year 52. Congratulations, everyone. It was a hard year, but the Romans are victorious. Roma Invicta. I'll stop it there, but thank you again, everyone, so much for listening. Thank you for joining me on the stream today. Thank you for listening if you're on YouTube. Thank you for sticking out this whole time. You've been listening for an hour. Congratulations. I'll be back next week for the next one. You guys can follow, like, and subscribe. It all helps me out. Until then, I appreciate you all so much. Thank you for the support. And I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.